Hello and welcome to another episode of the AIGA Design Podcast. My name is Lishan Huang, Senior Director of Learning and Programs here at AIGA, the Professional Association for Design. On this show this season, we are exploring the theme of design and performance through different facets of those words. And so we are looking forward to having you explore that with us. And we are wherever you get your podcast, but also you can watch the video version on YouTube at AIGA Design. If you haven't seen us there, you can check out our guests and see our faces there as well.
Hi everyone, I'm Julia Donatello, Design Competitions and Events Manager at AIGA.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sahar Chung. I am an Associate Director of UX Research for Multiplayer, a UX agency, and I am located in the DC metropolitan area.
Thank you very much, Sahar, for being here and accepting our invitation. We're excited to learn more about you and also share with our listeners. Sahar, so I know you hold bachelor degree in fine arts with a minor in Korean studies. Very interesting, surprising. And then after that, you pursued a master's in UX. We are curious to learn more about you. If you can walk us through your motivations that led you to this path and your journey as a professional, as a designer in your career so far, and how have the Korean studies, in a way, inspired your path?
Yeah, it is an interesting background, my education background, but I think the best like kind of way to describe it is my first ever job while I was in undergrad was at NASA. I was an intern at NASA. I was a what we call a NASA contractor, and that job, though not called UX, because they don't really use that, especially back then, it was a basically like a service design information architecture role. And I don't know, it like set the stage. Even when I worked as a graphic designer after undergrad, I tended to work in roles that were very related to service design and information architecture like throughout my career. And so my second job kind of while I was still in undergrad was also as a media researcher, which is a lot more on the desk research side where I'm like digging in and trying to Google people and understand like who works at what outlet and what's their background. And so that was also like a really funny thing to look back on and be like, oh, I was literally doing what we call desk research as a researcher now. But yeah, I think what kind of drew me to the US side was just looking back on my career and looking at like I love graphic design, I love illustration. What else do I enjoy about the work that I do? And I found that, I had been doing so much service design and I'm good at it because my brain is very like process oriented. I'm like, oh, I love to like figure out like a good process for people and make sure it's usable. And so that was kind of the reason I went into my master's in UX was to kind of formalize my education around that area. And yeah, I like fell in love with like the research aspect of UX, and so that was kind of like my journey. But I think with the Korean studies also, it was really cool. I had the chance to study abroad in Seoul, South Korea. I've visited many other times after that. I just love it. And I think it is really helpful to have kind of this global perspective of not just like was design in America as like our world is more globalized because of the internet and everything. It has been really helpful to have like this anchor of like what does design look like in Korea or Asia or wherever else. It just was like a really helpful experience to like open my mind a little bit in that way.
Wow, lovely. Very, very cool. I love it. And you mentioned that you're very passionate about illustration and how that
Yeah,
is connected to the beginning of your practice. How do you
yeah.
think this is intertwined, your fine arts training with being a researcher in practice currently?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that that's such a good question because I think first of all, like one of my main cross-functional partners as a researcher is designers, and so having a design background isn't that common. It's not that uncommon either for researchers, but I find that it helps me really understand what their goals, motivations, like what their needs are. Um, and so being able to partner really closely with my design counterparts has been much more seamless. I would say like one of my last jobs where I worked for a cybersecurity company, we had a very small UX team and I was the only researcher. We had two designers, and the director of UX. And what was really cool about having a design background was I would just sit in there and be like playing around with like wireframes and like sketching things out with them, based off of the research that I had, conducted and what the insights were telling us. And that was like a cool thing to be able to like go into an ideation phase with them as a partner and not have to say like hand off, have fun, but more be able to be in it and collaborate with them. So that was really, really awesome. We used to do design critiques like twice a week, and I would be able to say like from a visual design perspective, I do have like some ideas for what you are working on. And so that was really cool. I think another fun thing with illustration, I did a big like 6-month research back persona project while I was at that company. And we had to kind of deliver these personas in a way that was usable. Of course, I don't want to just be like, here's a lot of text, have fun trying to figure out who these people are. So I really spent time on the visual design of like how to present them. And I made these like cards and I illustrated instead of using like free photos off of like Unsplash, I illustrated different people that might be that persona. And so it was like fun to bring like the illustration side into the research side.
That's awesome. I'd love
Yeah.
to jump back in time a little bit. You mentioned being a contractor at NASA earlier in your career, which is very cool. My partner's actually doing a PhD at an aerospace group at
Amazing.
MIT at the moment, too. And I actually had the chance to visit the Jet Propulsion Laboratory
So
in
cool.
2019 when we had our AIGA conference there and gave a guest lecture there. But anyway, yeah, I'm curious about you. Like, can you share a little bit more about that experience? You were saying that they didn't really have UX as like a label as a job function then. So what was the role of design while you were there at NASA and how did you fit in as a designer even if they didn't officially have that UX label?
Yeah, it's so interesting because I think a lot of times when we think about NASA, we're like, oh, the logo, it's so iconic.
Yeah.
Like, there is like this like aspect of NASA where we think about like design, that like retro is like
Hmm.
space vibe.
Yeah.
All these things that really were like pioneered by NASA or influenced by NASA. But it was really interesting. NASA is a federal agency. It's huge. Things are can be slow. It's weird because there's this kind of juxtaposition of NASA as like this huge innovator in the science like space,
Hmm.
science and math and like the way that they're kind of like always innovating on that end. And then on the other side, we have kind of like the business side of NASA, and that
Yeah.
tends to be a little bit slower in how they're adopting new technology. I remember one of I think this was my second internship with NASA. I my whole job was basically an information architect. I worked at this library for a specific type of satellite, and the library was a literal room with file folder like, it was, like, file cabinets, manila folders from 1968 until 2000 whenever, like, early 2000 when I had the internship, and it was just, like, paper. It was just, like, so much paper, and they were like, "We're gonna digitize
Yeah.
all of this," and we were like,
Right.
"Okay." But it was really cool because there was no process. It was new for them to say, "We're gonna digitize this and make this available but secure on like a shared drive for
Yeah.
everyone."
Totally.
So that was like a new thing at the time, and this was like before SharePoint even. So You can imagine. But it was a really cool thing to be like, on the one hand, very manual, digging through every paper. It was like we are building this process as we go. But then on the other hand, it was like cool to be able to like innovate a little bit around how we were going to tackle the problem.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
yeah, so it's like this weird like balance of like there is like opportunity to innovate. It just might sound like to some people the most boring thing in the world, and to me, I'm like, ooh, how are we gonna catalog all of it?
Yeah, yeah.
What's the folder schema gonna look like? um,
Well, I feel like a
yeah,
lot of that is like the innovation that happens maybe in the background, or it's less
yes,
sexy than like
yes.
the literal rocket launch, or even like the logo as you're talking about. I think this is a big debate in the design world. So I'd love your take on this. Sahar, are you team meatball or team worm when it comes to the NASA logos?
I am team worm. I just find it to be so like classic, clean, lovely. I used to hate the meatball. I will
Yeah.
take it back now. I don't hate it anymore. I think it is very reminiscent of like the 90s. It feels
Yeah.
so 90s, like a little bit like the sans serif and like I mean sorry, the serif font and then
Yeah,
like the
yeah.
all that like detail in the back and you're like, I can't even look like this. But I think it is really iconic now and like I think there's a special place for both, but I am team worm.
Yeah. I'm team worm as well. There's just something very like mid-century retro
Yes.
futurist about it, but the minimalism I think works, especially if it's going to be like
Yeah.
on a uniform or like
Yes.
on a spacecraft kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very cool. Um, um, you mentioned that earlier when you started your career, the naming of the role wasn't even UX research or UX then. I'm also curious
Yeah.
to hear more from you. How do you think are the key differences when it comes to research and how the naming has changed? So it started customer
Yeah.
research, consumer, user, and now experience research over the last decades. What are the major shifts that you see in the agenda setting when it comes to research? And where do you see this going? So what's the evolution of this field? Like what's the future? What are the trends that
Yeah.
you see?
Yeah, I think that it's so interesting because I still see a lot of differences in like these job titles depending on the organization, honestly. So we'll sometimes see like customer research and that they'll, an org will call it that even if the research is for employees. Like so it's not really a customer in the traditional sense, but that's what they call it. I see like user research, I see UX research, I see design research where you're like really researching for as like a partner to the design part of the work. And I feel like it all depends. That part of it at this point feels very like it just depends on the different or what their focus is. Sometimes there might be a connection to like the US maturity of a company. But I honestly think it sometimes just depends on the org chart and like where research is sitting. I know that in my past experiences, research has sat under the product team. It sat on the design, like design was its own function, and it was just there by itself. There engineering. I've seen it. Where research is under engineering. I haven't experienced this myself, but I know a lot of people who as researchers have been like, yeah, my research, like US research is under marketing because it is connected to market research, even though it's
Mhm.
not the same function. Um, but there's overlap. And so I think, yeah, it really just depends on like how companies are set up. So some of it is goes back to that. Um, I think the evolution, however, from a US standpoint, US started and it was very like that's folks doing everything. They might be a generalist, they might be doing some research and some design and some strategy. And then all these niches kind of grew out of that over time as like the field matured. Right now, with kind of the way the research field is moving, um, there have been a lot of layoffs in tech in the last like 2 years, and we're still seeing some happening, even now. What the talk on the street, so to speak, is that research is kind of evolving as like more of a strategic partner, and so instead of saying like, here are my insights. it's now up to you. It's more like let me map my insights to like business goals and team goals and department goals and really understand like how far reaching the insights can be and what the impact of them might be. And then over time you can even actually measure the impact of those sales. But that is kind of what we're seeing. A lot of the conversation is around right now. And I think a big part of that is like, the layoffs, but it kind of almost allowed everyone to like take a moment to be like, what, how can we be that like a value to our partners and our stakeholders? Um, so yeah, that's the big convo right now.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for your perspective on the current trends.
Yeah.
You also mentioned in the beginning of our conversation that you're more of a process-oriented person, and I'm curious to learn more. How is like a standard project or like a routine project that you have experienced from a research point of view? So from the beginning until the end? So how do you engage with the stakeholders involved? How do you build that flow with your team?
Yeah, it's a really hard question. I think that everyone kind of has their own way of tackling that, and of course, depending on like what type of project it is, like the like nitty gritty of it might change. But
Mm-hmm.
for me, I definitely have like my like here's like kind of the beats that I want to hit in this project, and the most important to me is going into any project with what I call like a problem solving exercise or like alignment kickoff. And so what I would do is I bring like all my cross-functional partners, if they're available, ideally, into one room, usually still online. It might be a Zoom room, but we'll all hit into one space. We'll all hit into one big jam together. And I have kind of a workshop that I lead that helps me understand all the context I need to know. What we also try to do with that is be very problem first and not solution first. So I don't, they might my partner might come to me, a product manager might say, "Hey, I think we need to add this feature," and that is a solution. So what I'll do is I'll be like, "Okay, let's dig into that and let's understand why do we think that that feature is needed." We'll go kind of backwards and understand what is the problem we're trying to understand better so that we can move forward with actually making a decision about a solution. And so yeah, in that alignment meeting, we'll slope down the problem. I'll write a refined problem statement based off of it. But the other thing I like about it is we also will write down everyone's assumptions, everyone's biases. What questions do I need more? If the people in that room don't have the answer, I'll write down all the questions I need to know dig more into with other stakeholders, and usually the people that are with me will be able to put me in the right direction if I don't know who to hit up. Um, but what I think that really sets like a good foundation for any project because you really like let's all take a moment, let's like rewind, let's all really understand where we're starting from so we can move forward really methodically. It'll help me figure out what methodologies to use because depending on what whatever the problem is that we're trying to understand better will help me write research questions or goals and then questions and then you kind of like have this like waterfall like okay now I know that I can figure out what methodology is. The other big thing is I'll understand like constraints whether that is time or budget sometimes. Sometimes it's like technical constraints when you work on really technical projects. It's like what is even possible here in this space. So I think that's a big one where I'm like that will set the stage. As for the actual like project moving forward, depending on the methodologies, everything will be different. But my big thing is I will always have a touch point with my cross-functional team. So whether that's like a weekly sale, where we can all just be like, here's where we're at, here's what I'm learning, here's what I'm doing. Has anything changed? Like or sometimes a project timeline is gonna change. Like you just don't know. So having that like close touch point is really important. And then from there, because I have these like check-ins, I'm not like waiting for like this aha moment at the end. I'm bringing them along with me so
Mm-hmm.
that it feels very collaborative. I think that's really, really important. I say this all the time, and I'm gonna say it here. A big part of being a UX researcher is relationship building. It is like understanding, the pain points of your cross-functional team and like your stakeholders, because you're gonna be able to do your best work when you have that full picture. And so, yeah.
I want to pick up on the point you made earlier about relationships. You We talked about your experience at NASA earlier on in your career. Since then, you've worked in a variety of fields, from the game industry to cybersecurity. So as a designer, we often have to work with people from
Yeah.
very different industries and disciplines, right, that are different from our own. So how do you engage in these highly technical subjects like cybersecurity or even the game industry, where you're collaborating with subject matter experts who maybe don't know design or who are quite different from designers? Like, how do you become enough of an expert in the process to engage while also working with experts in their respective fields?
Yeah, it is like a really funny thing because I personally am like, ooh, like really complex industries. I'm like, I love it, like more of that. And I think it's because as a researcher and like service designer and like my background, I'm always just like, ooh, I want to like dig around and understand this like area that I might not know that well. But I think the big thing is like when I started in cybersecurity, I had never worked in cybersecurity before. I had worked at NASA, which had very stringent security policies, so I was aware of it from like a user perspective. Where I'm like, I don't know how it works, maybe, but I do know like what I have to be very mindful of, right? And I remember my manager at the time was like, I kind of love that you don't have a cybersecurity background because you have less bias. Like you're just
Mm.
coming in fresh. You're looking at the space like with new, fresh eyes. And so I went into that really like looking to learn, but also knowing that I'm not going to be the expert in the room. And even now, like I worked there almost 2 years. I still have all this like security knowledge in my brain, but I'm not an expert. I know that like other people know way more than me. um, but what was really helpful was when you're preparing to talk to a highly technical person like a security admin or a chief information security officer, you're just gonna know that you're gonna go into it. Let's say I'm doing like a user interview with this type of like user, you just know that they're gonna probably say words that you don't understand, and that's okay. And it's also okay to say, "Hey, could you describe that to me?" Or imagine I'm like a third grader, can you explain that back to me like a little bit more simply? Um, it's okay to do that. It's also okay to be like, I don't have time to dig into that. So just depending on what the situation calls for. I think the other thing was going back to what the relationship building aspect that we were talking about. Like I relied on my team, the company, everyone across the company to be my kind of like technical partners
Hmm.
in trying to understand. First of all, our product was super technical itself, so learning that was a whole thing, and it took a village. To help me understand it really well. But also just understanding a lot of the jargon, a lot of like the different like cybersecurity attacks that might be out there. Like just understanding the landscape of the field was really, really, really helps by having really good relationships and building those relationships. I think one good example was I did this information architecture project while I was there. There were features in the product that were like toggles you could toggle on and off. Like, do I want to have this set down, turned on? And I was like, "I don't know what this is." And so part of my initial, like, desk research was, like, let me meet up with a bunch of stakeholders and figure out what each part of this product is, like, what do they mean? Because a lot of the product had been built and the, like, labels and the UX writing have been done by, like, engineers over the years, and they understand the really technical and maybe, like, not everyone is gonna understand it the same way, and so it was very helpful to, like, go around and kind of sleuth and figure it out, but it all came down to the relationships and, like, people being happy and willing to help because we were had that collaborative back and forth already.
That's great. I love that you brought that they valued the fact that you didn't know much about
Yeah.
cybersecurity to bring this new perspective to the table and probably ask questions
Uh-oh.
that they
I
did
know.
not think about. Yeah, I think it has a lot to do with bringing a diverse team to the table. And I think based on what you mentioned earlier, that you're very interested on bringing this global understanding, multicultural approach to your practice, starting from your Korean studies interest. I'm curious to learn more from you. What types of methods that you create with your team when you're choosing what path to follow in the research process, that you understand it's inclusive and generating insights that are applicable for a wider audience. So taking into account this multicultural context.
Yeah, I think the big thing with kind of embracing like diversity and inclusivity as a UX professional, whether design or research, um, it's one of the cornerstones of like how we want to, especially in research, I think, as we recruit users for our studies, we want to make sure that we're avoiding like any inherent bias. So an example is like for that cybersecurity company, I don't wanna only talk to chief information security officers that are men because, like, I know that there are women out there who do this, do this role, even if they're not the majority. And so that was a big part of, I did this big persona project with them, and it was also, like, making sure there was, diversity from all vectors. It's not just, like, female, male, non-binary, but it was also, like, looking at different races of people who are in these roles and not trying to pigeonhole myself into just one area, I think. And so as a researcher, we're always trying to make sure that we have a very representative sample and that we're not just defaulting to like the easy to find recruiting needs. And so it does come down to whenever we recruit for users for any study, we'll always write a screener, and it really comes down to like making that very inclusive. And so you might think like, oh, it's just a screener, it's easy, and it's like, yeah, it is, but you want to make sure that it isn't accidentally leaving out certain groups of people. And so there's that aspect of it that is really important. I think there's also, I've worked on projects that have a global audience, and knowing that like if people like aren't just American, then I shouldn't only do the research with Americans, because then you're really pigeonholing. But those insights are very, very skewed to one part of the user base. So you just want to make sure that whatever research you're doing has like that representation in the actual recruiting processes and stuff.
Yeah, I want to pick up on this global point that you made about diversity, which is very much like under attack right now. But the reality for business, regardless of your politics, is that especially for service-based tech companies, right, for UX research, we have to consider users from diverse cultures, geographic
Yeah.
backgrounds, but also just like, who live in different bodies. Right.
Yeah.
So, how do you ensure that those methods are actually inclusive? You said a little bit about it already in terms of including different kinds of research subjects and collaborators. But yeah, how do we encompass that into our research methods and also in the insights part of it and gathering insights? And yeah, could you maybe give examples in the context of a project?
Yeah, I think that one of the big things is like, I've been a US research team of one, as in like I was the only researcher at a lot of companies. When you have other researchers, it becomes so much more helpful because you're able to like bounce stuff off of each other and be like, am I on the right path here? The diversity of your team helps with that, right? Where people
Yeah.
are all coming in with their own diverse perspectives. My team now is quite diverse and a little bit larger, and so we have like that nice synergy of being able to like do that with each other. But even at like a couple of my last companies where I was the only researcher, but I worked with designers, they're also still there as your partners, and they are also there to be your kind of diverse like thought partners in the work. And so I think that the big thing is understanding best practices is really important here. You don't have to hold it alone. You don't have to like figure it out from scratch. Like there are going to be good practices for how to, and you can kind of dig around online and like with different, thought leaders in the space. But, there will be other practices around like that inclusivity and like making sure that there is diverse representation. I think also when you present the insights, like you mentioned at the end of kind of your question, I, for example, that persona project where I illustrated the different so I had 3 personas at the end of the 6-month research-backed, project. I, interviewed 30 people, um, and we had down to, like, these are the segments, these are the 3 personas, and what we kind of saw was, like it was, like, a really cool thing, like, they weren't like, the people I talked to within each of those personas was very diverse from all different vectors, and so when I did the illustrations, I really made sure to say, like, you know, like, different, groups were represented for each. I did 3 drawings for each persona as, like, a this is because I think when you do a persona, and personas are always, like, a little bit of a hot topic, I think, but when you do personas, often you'll see one visual representation of what
Mhm.
that persona is, right? It'll be like one person, a drawing or an image, a photo, and it's kind of like to help people empathize as like this is who it is. My manager, who was the director of UX, we actually talked a lot about like let's not do that,
Uh-huh.
and let's try to represent each persona as 3 different versions of who they might be, because a persona is not one person. It's like a group that is helping define and understand a group of people, right?
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and so I really made sure to say, like, there's, like, a lot of representation that this one persona that fits a life might actually be represented by very different people. In other aspects of their life, they might not be very similar, but in the way that they think about their work, they are the same, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think just personas in general, I feel like there's a lot of caveats to them
Yeah,
in terms of just taking them with a grain of salt. And again, like the representation, it's like it's not a real person, but there's still
yes,
something helpful about them. I think they're controversial too, right? Like some
yeah,
people like are like, let's not do personas anymore. But even if you use real people, there's always going to be some sort of selection bias of like who are these real people that you
yeah,
selected to feature, right? Whereas a
yes.
persona might be a way to make some generalizations, which we always have to do when we're designing at scale.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Sahar, I know you've been very involved and supportive in the UX community through events and mentorship, and I'm yeah, I'm curious to hear more from you in terms of advice that you can share with our listeners interested in starting a career in UX or UX research or making a transition from another career to this space. What are your recommendations and what are the transferable skills you think folks might bring from other fields?
Yeah, it's a really good question because there are a lot of transferable skills. So I think the first thing I'll say is, I mentioned it earlier, US and just tech are going through a little bit of a rough patch, but that doesn't mean like you can't pivot and you can't transition into a career in like US. I think you just have to be kind of thoughtful about how you go about it. So my big thing is, set what your current role is or your history or your experience that you've had in your career. Look at that through the US lens. So what I mean by that is like as you're learning, whether it's self-taught or if you're in a program, if you're learning about UX, understanding kind of like what the role is, what are the keywords that you kind of need to understand, what are the methodologies that you should be familiar with, all that. And then I always tell people to like look back, like reflect, almost like do a workshop with yourself on Big Jam if it's helpful, and say, you know, if this is like the methodology or the thought process or the skill needed in this field, do any of my jobs have areas where I was doing that and it just wasn't called that? I think a really good example is like healthcare, because again, like people that work in healthcare, whatever their role, I've mentored people who were occupational therapists or, people who were like nurses and they wanted to like transition into UX research, they have this ability because of their role to ask questions to the heart of someone's pain points, right? You're building rapport with your patients and you're trying to understand where they're coming from and you're having empathy for them so that you can treat them better. Are they written how a US researcher might write them? Probably not, but that I think that it's such a good foundation of like having those skills already, and then you just build off of them. I think another field that really does move well into US is like education because again you're you're helping people learn, and a lot of what you do in US is figure out how to help people learn how to use things more easily. So it's like, how do I make this usable? How do I make this learnable for someone? That is even a metric that sometimes we will even try to measure is like the learnability of a product. Is it if I put this in front of someone, how much handholding do they need um, before they can actually use it by themselves without me having to be there with them or without customer support? And so I think that again, like education can really like transfer well. So again, it really is so many fields. I'll even say, one of my jobs when I was in college was I worked for the hair brand Aveda, and Aveda had this really specific way of how you talk to the customers. They call them the guests that will come in, but the customers will come in and they're like, "I need new shampoo," and you don't just ask them yes or no questions. They've always said ask open-ended questions like,
Mhm.
"Tell me about your hair. Tell me what problems you are facing with your hair care currently. Tell me about your current routine with your hair," whatever it is. And that is a whole like US research kind of way of looking at writing questions for a user interview is like open ended, don't ask yes or no questions. Try to let people because you don't know the yes or no is gonna be such a small, narrow view of what the actual big picture is. Allow them to kind of paint the picture for you. And that was just like a retail job. um, but I always tell that story because I'm like, it was kind of cool. I was like doing UX research without, I was learning the best practices without even being a researcher yet.
I love what you brought about the transferable skills for for, for folks who are working with education. That's a um, point that I had not thought about when it comes to
Yeah.
designing new products and how learnable that product can be, and bringing this skill to the table is it's very relevant.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that connects well with the theme of the podcast and also of our conference this season. And for folks listening, watching to this, the AIGA Design Conference in 2025 is October 9th through 11th in Los Angeles, California. We'll post a link to this, but we'd love to see you there. But for Sahar, the theme is design and performance, and you've already alluded to a little bit of this in terms of building relationships, but also your experience working at Aveda and asking these open-ended questions with the guests, with the customers here. And so just ask all of our guests this season to riff on this theme of design and performance, right? Because as researchers, you are preparing a script, but you're also an improviser because something interesting could happen during the interview, during the site visit, however you're conducting that research. So I'd love to have you, reflect on that and riff on this theme of how you see performing your role as a
D-
researcher.
Yeah, I love this theme. And I think there's a few different ways it really shows up as a researcher. Um, One of them is, like you said, like when you're in a user interview, you're in a usability test that is moderated, you're in there with the user. Sometimes it's not gonna hold the way you think, and that's a good thing. I think those are where, like, the really, like, interesting nuggets of information come from. So, again, best practices, write those open-ended questions. We always have a discussion guide when we prepare. But I always and this is a thing that I teach my team too, is I always have follow-up questions underneath every question where I'm like, "Here's the big theme that I'm gonna let be really open-ended." And then if they don't talk about this aspect, I'm gonna nudge them on that, you know? And so it's just like having these little follow-ups to help hide things, but also allow the user to take you, you know, where they want to take you in their answer, because if that's what they care about, that's important, you
Uh-huh.
know? That is definitely, there's like that aspect of like, it's like structured, unstructured. 'Cause sometimes the questions will go in a different order than you thought. Like they're gonna answer two questions in one. So just being really like on your feet and ready to like move and be fluid and move with it, I think is really helpful. I also love that you said the word improv, because I
Mhm.
really feel like I haven't taken an improv class. I'm like, should I? Because I feel like it would be such a like relevant skill to like practice in that way, because you just have to be able to like pivot and move with the flow and that kind of thing as a researcher. And that is also true when you're presenting information. I think
Totally.
presenting anything as anyone, not just a researcher, is a performance. You are performing. I always try to right now actually on my team, um, we started this thing every 2 weeks. We do what I call "Tell Me Why." Um,
Yeah.
and so someone has to sign up and present something for 10 minutes,
Mm,
and then we provide feedback, we ask questions, because isn't always opportunity for everyone, especially like intermediate, like mid-level and lower, to present their insights to our clients, because they're not, you know, usually that's going to be like the senior person on the team. And so I want them to have that practice still. And so I'm like, present anything. It doesn't have to be current work. It can be whatever, but we want to think about this as a story and not just I did this, I learned this is my recommend, like, that no one cares about, that's so boring.
Yeah.
Like, even as a researcher, my eyes will glaze over if I'm in a presentation that's just like, chronologically, blah, blah,
Yeah,
blah,
yeah.
blah. And I've done it. I've done it too as an intermediate. Like, I was like, I don't know. This is how I want them to know the work I did. No one cares about, they don't know what those words are. Like, you know, when I say, like, I did this methodology, they're like, I don't know what that is. So just know your audience, like be able to speak to your audience. If you're talking to like a product team, what do they care about? If you're talking to like the whole company, you're gonna want to be more generalized. You want to speak to multiple different people within, you know, the same presentation. So it's just about like figuring out that flow. I will say it also, I feel like people who play Dungeons and Dragons would be really
Yeah.
because that is improv ultimately, right? Like
Totally.
you're in the moment, you're playing a character, you're figuring out how to respond in real time to different things that pop up. And I do love D&D, so I any chance I can like talk about it in anything I will. But yeah.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned both of those things because I've been doing improv for the last almost 2 years now. Actually, just started teaching it or being a teaching assistant for it here in Providence. But recently I went to a show where it was Dungeons and Dragons improv. So they had
very cool.
comedians like do a live show of D&D, like a single, like one shot, you know, rather
Mhm.
than a campaign. And it very much is like improv adjacent.
Yeah.
You know, certainly doing this show is like this too, right? Like Julie and I have questions prepared, but we're also just riffing with you, connecting with you
Yeah.
in the moment for follow up and stuff like that. So I recommend it to any designer, any researcher, because even if you never perform for the public in an improv show, or if you don't think you're funny, there's still skills there that just help you
Yes.
be in the moment and improvise in your own job or even prepare you for public speaking. Because if I think for most people, like memorizing your speech and trying to give it or reading off cue
Yeah.
cards, like they all have their own kind of issues of being like kind of robotic or like, you know,
Yeah.
sometimes the audience just responds to different things and you have to know your stuff well enough to be able to riff in the moment, right? Especially with a live
Absolutely.
audience.
So true. And I also tell people when I used to mentor a lot more when I had more bandwidth for that, which was really awesome. But whenever I mentor people that were trying to like pivot into, you know, US research and they
Mhm.
had like questions about like interviewing, I'm like, it's improv. Like
Yeah,
being in a
yeah.
job interview is improv. You don't know what questions they're going to ask necessarily. You can prepare as much as you can, but you have to be ready to like pivot and play with the flow a little bit. And so I think improv is just like such a hard thing to hone. Yeah, I love that. It's so cool that you are teaching it now. So like very, very awesome.
Very cool. Um, yeah, Sahar, I know that in 2023, you and Taryn Lambert co-founded Confetti Q&A, and I'm curious to learn more about what are the initiatives that you've been engaged with this organization and what motivated you to create.
Yeah, so Taryn was my manager in my last role, and we were both laid off at the same time, as many people have experienced in the last 2 years. So at the end of 2023, we were laid off, and we just loved working together so much. We were like, I still want to talk to you every day. So let's make up a reason to do that. And so we were like, well, there are things that our field goes through as a community, as a collective. Why don't we just try hosting like panel webinar style combos around these things? It has us an excuse to still hang out a lot, but then also it's something that, like, if it's a topic that's coming up a lot for the field, why not? Like, people are probably all talking about it. They would love to like be more involved in this kind of like community activity. So they had our first panel. It was in January 2024, and it was about layoffs, and it was like about navigating and trying to feel empowered while, when you host for something like that, it's really disheartening and it feels not great. And so we had a couple other folks who had been laid off on the panel with us, and we just prepared some questions, and kind of similar to what we were just saying, like, we talked, we let the convo move with the flow, we had audience members asking us questions that we would then like answer in real time, and it was just like very. We didn't want it to be really formal, and like we just wanted to feel like helpful to people. And afterwards, we did an impromptu little like I don't know, after party. It was all online, but we like opened up a whole meet, and it was like whoever wants to come can come. And then we had like these more like deep kind of combos between people who were going through the same thing, and it was just really lovely. It felt like, I don't know, right now, with just the madness of the world and how everything's really just going a million miles an hour, it feels really helpful to have these outlets of community and where you can connect with other people who are not all like, oh, rainbows and roses and butterflies. It's like, no, sometimes things suck, and it helps to just be like, it sucks together. And maybe we don't have an answer for it, but at least we have each other. And so we've done a couple others. We did 2 other talks last year. One of them was about like the state of hiring in tech and in US specifically. And then we did a third one that was about like the future of work and what do we think like work is going to look like in the future. We have our next panel coming out, and it's all about uncertainty,
Oh,
which I think will
Amazing.
be fun. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, do share that with us.
Yeah.
Well, we're not sure when this is going to be published, but we'll figure it out if you
Yeah,
have
because there'll be a
documentation.
video.
Okay.
There'll be a video, so you can always share it. But it'll be, I think, really helpful because I know I am feeling uncertain all the
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of particular uncertainties, but even in sort of maybe more certain times, there's always an
Always.
uncertainty, right? In terms of trying to have a career and do all of that, especially
Yeah.
in this industry.
Yeah.
So we're unfortunately starting to wrap up our time together, but I've really
Yeah.
enjoyed this conversation, this hangout. So Sahar, we love to wrap up asking all of our guests about inspiration. Do you have something that you would like to recommend to our listeners, our viewers? So it could be a book, a show, a movie, any piece of media to recommend to our community here. And then you can also end with a call to action for where folks can follow up and connect with your work as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm gonna go straight back to my D&D. The little call out, because if you haven't watched Fantasy High, it is a live play on dropout.tv. They have this like kind of series called Dimension 20, and they do all kinds of different D&D shows. Fantasy High is one of my favorite shows. I'm rewatching it for the 4th time right now from the start. But it's a tabletop role-playing game. They play D&D. It's kind of this fun coming of age John Hughes high school, but with elves and orcs and goblins and
Yeah.
and it's really fun. It's funny. I think there's a lot of cool. First of all, I learned how to play D&D from this. So if you've never played D&D, it's a great place to start because all the players, almost all of them, had never played until this campaign. They are all comedians and people who with improv backgrounds. Yeah, I think that it's a perfect way to wrap up because we talked about improv earlier and D&D, and I think it's a really cool, fun show. I highly recommend it. First season, fully free on YouTube.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you for that
Yeah.
recommendation. And then what about your work and how folks can connect with you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always available to connect on LinkedIn, and I'll, share the link with everyone. Just search for my name. You'll find I'm the only one, the only Sahar Chung, so it'll be easy to find me. And then my website, I have a blog where sometimes I'll post stuff on LinkedIn, and I'm like, you know what, I'm gonna dig into this some more, so I'll post on my blog. It's www.saharchum.com/blog, and you can find all my thoughts over there. Hopefully a newsletter coming soon. I haven't set that up yet, but it's on my mind. And then Confetti Q&A is also on LinkedIn, and we do all of our panels live on LinkedIn. So if you follow us there, you'll always know what's going on with us.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks again for hanging out with us and chatting,
Yeah.
Sahar. So on behalf of the AIGA Design Podcast, thanks again, and thank you to our viewers or listeners for tuning in. Hope to see you in another episode or at our design conference this fall in Los Angeles.
Thank you so much. It was so fun hanging out with both of you.
Same
Thank
here.
you,
All right.
Sahar.
Bye, everyone.